Good morning. Saturday. No work today. Thank God. Back to the campaign recap. Now, where we left off last week, the group had entered the dungeon, which I normally referred to as the Gygaxian, based on the fact that basically it was a dungeon that I created inspired by the old-style Gary Gygax trap dungeons that are very light on enemies and heavy on thinking of ways to get out of things. Now, the group had been separated into three parts. One part in a banquet chamber with an undead or dead or not dead, depending on who was looking at him and who was thinking what, king. Susha had a vision of the king as he was in life. The rest of the group that was in the room were eating and drinking. Sinclair was trapped on the other side of a door ahead of the group in an area they had not been to yet. The remainder of the group was trapped in a room behind the banquet room where they had not gotten into the room quickly enough. A few minutes pass. Sinclair begins to explore the area to the south and discovers another trap. Or what he believes is a trap. He finds a large lever in the next room. He flips the switch and begins to hear a booming countdown. 10, 9, 8. But as this countdown starts, all of the doors that had sealed and locked around the banquet room open. Continues counting down, counting down. Some of the group run through to the area that Sinclair is in. Some of the group remain in the room with the banquet. The countdown continues. 3, 2, 1. And then as the countdown reaches 0, all of the doors lock yet again. They pause a few moments and then decide to flip the switch again in room 16, the room that Sinclair had moved into ahead of the group. The countdown starts over. 10, 9, 8. This time, as the countdown starts, they notice that one of the walls in the room with the switch has begun sliding forward, closer to them, shrinking the room. Tiawan, who's there at the switch at this point, flips the switch a third time. And the countdown starts over. 10, 9, 8. Sinclair and Bill start opening other doors, kind of at random at this point. Sinclair finds a room that looks like some kind of a whiskey cellar or an alcohol larder. Bill opens another door and finds what looks to be a food larder. As this is happening, the countdown continues, and Tiawan flips the switch for a fourth time. And once again, it starts over. 10, 9, 8. Sinclair then moves to the south into another room where he sets off another trap. The room seems to be filled with mirrors, and as he enters the room, one of the mirrors shatters and covers him in shrapnel, cutting into him. Finally, they manage to make their way out of the sliding wall room. They manage to find a way past the mirror room and eventually reach a stairway that leads downwards. And in this stairway room, there's a sealed door, and there are 4 pedestals. And each of the pedestals seems to have a riddle on it, or a statement, or a clue of some kind. One of the clues that they have basically is a clue that relates to rulership. And in all of the chaos of leaving the banquet room, Sinclair had actually grabbed the crown off the dead king's head, thinking it might be valuable. On a lark, or on a guess, they decided to put the crown onto the podium marked rulership. As they did, the podium began to glow, and then they noticed that 1/4 of the door, a gem inset in that, began to glow. At which point they realized that there were obviously 3 other items in the dungeon which they needed in order to open the door, to get deeper. This caused a lot of frustration among the group, because obviously they had made their way through the dungeon to the door by what they thought was the fastest route possible, only to find out that they had to go back and fill in the rest of the map. Yep, they weren't very happy, but they backtracked back through the mirror room, took a closer look into the whiskey room that Sinclair had found previous, discovering that the barrels of whiskey were of an ancient vintage that were part of the cargo that was stolen by the pirate Kozar from Sanshara. So another link between the pirate prince and Susha's uncle that they had not been previously aware of. They continue backwards. They bypass the spiked pit room that had fallen prey to them that they had fallen prey to earlier. They head back to the room with the 2 paintings. Now, this was the room that I mentioned last week, that had the trap that they had been hit by but not really figured out. They took a bit of a different path for destroying it this week. They literally threw explosives into the room and destroyed everything. Yep, that did work. I mean, it wasn't what I had predicted as a solution, but it certainly did work. They then head back further, and at some point along the way, they realize that the dragon statue that they had encountered early on in the dungeon is likely one of the keys. And they decide to head back for it, only to realize then that, oh yeah, we threw that into the Froghemoth's room, that we then closed in and ignored. So, I mean, they went about killing the Froghemoth in the most efficient way possible. The creature was bigger than the door, so they opened the door and ranged attacked it to death as it tried to hide in the corner and cry, basically. It was a dumb beast. It wasn't necessarily evil. It was something that had been trapped in that room and starved. And they sat back and clinked it to death with arrows and spells as it cried and died. And yes, I did make sure that they felt suitably disgusted with themselves after that. Because, of course I was going to make them feel disgusted with themselves after that. They did pick up the dragon statue, though. They then move into a hallway which they had not explored earlier. And as they start looking, they realize that this long hallway has a number of traps which have already been set off. These traps are obviously already sprung. Now, there is debate over, well, has someone else here been here before us? Or is this some kind of a trick? Or what's going on? And, two of the members of the group decide to teleport to the end of the hallway and have a look at the other side. So Susha and Mr. X teleport to the end of the hallway. They pick their target location. As they arrive, Susha falls into a pit. Because he happened to pick the location that actually still had a hidden pit trap. He then summons his magical ladder to try to climb out of the pit. And then, in a very kind of odd course of events, Mr. X notices that the pit trap is beginning to close and reset itself. And he doesn't think Susha is going to make it out of the pit before it basically cuts him in half. So, rather than grabbing him and pulling him out, Mr. X grabs him and thinks, I'll save him by throwing him back into the pit. So he falls yet again to the bottom of the pit. Susha eventually then makes his way out of the pit after another climb up, and starts searching for traps using his trusty 10-foot pole. In the process, he does find a trigger, tries to set it off with the pole rather than with himself, and they watch as the trigger resets every trap in the hallway. So now, instead of having a hallway full of triggered traps, they have a hallway that they know is full of set traps, and half of the group on one side, half of the group on the other side. Susha and X at the end of the hallway there then start to look around and find a door. Tiawen triggers a magic item that she has, which gives her a flying cloud for her, basically. It has the stats of a flying carpet, but thematically it looks like a cloud. And she flies through the hallway to the end of the hall, starts searching for traps or secret doors. Now at this point, they are beaten, they are battered, they are poisoned, they are cursed, and they don't even realize some of those effects are on them. The food and drink from the banquet room were poisoned, throwing the dragon statue into the Froggymoth's room, the trap that they had set off in the fire pit room, all of those had caused effects to go onto the players, or onto the characters, that they had no idea were even on them. But their hit points were low, they were feeling the pain, it was not looking good for them. And that was where we ended the session, with them still half of the group on one side, half of the group on the other side of this hallway, trying to figure out what are we going to do. Now, they got very lucky at this point, though, because I don't think they were aware, but in between that session and the next session was Christmas. Now, they were aware of that, obviously. What they weren't aware of is the fact that I always give my players something for Christmas. Usually in-game. So throughout the week, I waited until Christmas Eve, and then I sent a message out to the group. Now, the message that I gave to them stated that as you stand deep within the Gygaxian dungeon, beneath the Prince's library, you feel a cold wind blow through the long hallway. You watch as a sheet of ice coats the walls and ceiling, and a soft layer of snow settles onto the stone floor. As the cold settles, you breathe deeply of crisp air, and find yourself revitalized and restored. Edgar notices that the black, festering wound in his side seems to close up and return to a more normal flesh tone, as does the purplish mark on Susha's face. Edgar, Susha, and X all breathe a sigh of relief, freed from the ticking clock of a potent dose of Midnight's tears, which most of them never even realized they had been afflicted with. Susha and Sinclair notice a small spark of electricity dance across their fingers, as the curse of bolt calling departs them. Flames dance in the air before Teowen, for a moment before shaping themselves into a tiny dragon, then freezing and shattering away into nothing. Susha coughs once, and a cloud of grey mist seems to leave his lips and dissolve into the cold air. Finally, the mist seems to solidify at the end of the hallway, forming into the shape of an icy door where before there was only a blank wall. Now, that was what I sent them on Christmas Eve. I clarified for them then, before the next game, I believe it was actually on Boxing Day on the 26th, that they all gained 1 level, advancing up to level 10. They were all fully healed. They recovered spells and abilities as if they had completed a short rest. And they were cured of all poisons, diseases, curses, and magical effects that were targeting them at that time. Now, this was not originally planned to happen in the middle of the Gygaxian. I had actually expected them to be out of here before then. But, as it worked out, it probably saved a couple lives, because I don't think they would have survived the dungeon without that having happened. So yeah, that could not have come at a better time. Now, on the 26th, the session following that Christmas present, they continued on through the Gygaxian. They found a giant statue with a series of gems, along with a brazier and an inscription. Basically, they find that the giant statue has 2 gems, a red gem and a blue gem, and then there is a brazier in its hands. They finally decide that they're going to remove both of the gems from the statue and put them into, and then put the blue gem into the brazier. As they do so, the giant statue transforms itself into a frost giant. Basically, the way that the puzzle worked was depending on what combination of gems they left in the statue and or placed in the brazier, there were different components of giants that could happen. They could have fought a fire giant, they could have fought a frost giant, they could have fought a storm giant. There were a few different patterns that they could have gone with. Frost giant ended up being one of the easier patterns, so good job working that out, or good job getting lucky, one or the other. I'm not quite sure which one they actually... they said they worked it out. not convinced they actually did. I think they guessed. They defeat the giant. They uncover a room that actually looks like a library, which is, ironic because this whole time they've supposedly been in a library. But they actually find a room filled with books, and they start grabbing some of the books that look important to them. Books about dwarven citadels, books about history of certain things. Once they spend a few minutes resting in that room, they decide, okay, we're going to head forward again. They open a door and find a dark room. Now, this is not a room that's just dark, but it's actually a room that is actively dark. You are holding a torch 5 feet from the door, and as soon as this torchlight reaches the entrance to that room, it abruptly stops. Magical darkness type dark room. So they then attempt to go into the room and set off a fire trap, which explodes outwards. Which of course means they then have to spend a few minutes putting out the fires because they're in a room full of books. And it's going to be a massive, massive fire if they don't put it out. They manage to put the fire out. Where then they start to realize that it seems that the room has some effect on fire. Edgar sends 3 dancing lights into the darkness, and each of the lights triggers yet another explosion. Sinclair then tries to throw a lantern into the room, thinking, okay, maybe it's just magical fire that it doesn't like. The lantern explodes. Susha then decides, okay, let's try this a bit differently. He goes into the room without a light, ties a rope around him, starts feeling his way around. As he's feeling his way along the walls, he becomes paralyzed. Because, of course, if you're building a trap room that's not allowed to have any light in it, and you're expecting people to feel around, you put contact poison on the walls. That just goes without saying, doesn't it? So they realize when he stops responding and becomes paralyzed, and they drag him out by the rope, smashing him along the ground as they do. Next, Mr. X goes in instead, feeling away with a stick, not actually touching anything. He manages to locate the door and then navigate them through the room, where they find a vault room that looks like it has a number of treasure chests. Now, of course, as they approach the treasure chests and as they go to open them, the chests try to eat them. They discover mimics. Not only that, but then they also discover that the ceiling of the room is full of lurkers. Because, why not? I'm back. Sorry about that. Got a phone call right in the middle of the conversation. So yeah, lurkers, mimics, lots of fun. Bill and Edgar, who are the ones who have first gotten into this room, open fire. Bill using explosives in a small room. They take out the mimics and the lurkers very quickly. The two of them also deafen themselves in the process. Good job, guys. They then moved on to the next room, where they very quickly set off a sliding wall trap. And again, the room starts shrinking on them. As the room is shrinking, they have a decision to make. Do they go north, or do they go south? Or do they stay in the room they were originally in? As it turns out, Sinclair, X, and Susha go north. Bill and Edgar go south. And Tia stays back in the room they were already in. Because they couldn't make a decision. And, well, time was a factor. So, they split the group again. At this point, even with the full heal that they got from the Christmas luck, I'm starting to wonder if they're going to survive this dungeon. The northern group. So this consists of X, Susha, and Sinclair. Move forward. And Mr. X tries to open the next door and vanishes. Susha inspects the door, figures out that it must be a teleportation trap of some kind, and then promptly sets off the trap himself. He vanishes. Sinclair decides he's not going to set off the trap, and decides to try to break down the door instead. Now, Mr. X and Susha find their way into a room where they find 3 statues. A white knight, a black knight, and a jade knight. A jade cleric. And eventually, as they're inspecting these statues and the etchings and the inscriptions on them, Sinclair manages to break through the door, hears them in the distance, breaks through 2 more doors, sets off a trap, and eventually gets to them. They then figure out basically that the 3 statues, each one has an oath. And there's a combination of saying the right oath to the right statue to get something to happen. They work out what they believe is the solution. Sinclair speaks an oath to the White Knight and is gifted with the White Knight's shield. Now, they spent a lot of time in this room trying to figure out what the right solution was. As it turns out, there was not actually, well, there kind of was a right solution. Speaking the oath to the White Knight would give you his shield. Speaking the oath to the Black Knight would give you his sword. Speaking to the oath to the Cleric would give your group, everyone in the room, basically bonuses, buffs. So, there wasn't actually a right or wrong answer. It was a matter of what you actually wanted to get out of it. I don't think they realized that at the time. Meanwhile, the southern group, Edgar lights a torch. They make their way to a room at the end of a hallway. There's an unlit sconce in that room, and they're trying to get a better look around, so Edgar decides to light that sconce. As he does, the room begins to fill with a billowing, thick, green smoke. They immediately rush out of the room and run back the way they came, where they encounter the fact that the door is now sealed because the sliding room that they came out of, the sliding wall room, has now blocked the door. Edgar pops a pair of gaseous form potions for them, so that they can basically slip out through the cracks and proceed onwards. My dogs are going insane. They make their way back, and eventually they make their way to meet up with Sinclair and the northern group. Meanwhile, Teowin is still trapped in the hallway, back the way they came from. Now, an element of time passes here, and eventually that green smoke from the southern room starts billowing out from under the door where Teowen is trying to figure out how to get through. She panics and decides to teleport and sends herself back to the stairway room. Back to the room where she kind of figures they'll be coming back to at some point. That was the end of Session 9. The end of the third section of the Gygaxian. I'm going to go ahead and stop there for the day. Next weekend we will finish up the Gygaxian and find out what happened after they left. Have a great day. Enjoy your weekend, and I will catch up with you again on Monday for my predictions on what will happen in this week's Monday night game. Enjoy!